Okay, in this video we're going to be talking about JavaScript, particularly on Node.js, which is commonly referred to as server-side JavaScript. We know there's sort of two concepts of JavaScript, right? There's JavaScript that we can run in a program and run it on our system. We can author the code and execute it on our system, just like Python or C or something like that. And then there's also the idea of JavaScript in the browser. Now, JavaScript in the browser is sort of the term they use is sandboxed. There's a safety net around it so that when you download a website, right, that's essentially what you're doing in a browser. You're going to a particular IP address and asking for a page, a document, an HTML document, and you download that, and if there's JavaScript on it, you execute that JavaScript. Well, that could be dangerous, right? You could execute some JavaScript and it could, look through your entire file system and see what's on your system and copy files and all sorts of stuff, right? So it has to be protected, right? So the browser JavaScript does not have access to your file system. So we're going to talk about reading and writing files, and that can only be done with server-side JavaScript with Node.js. So of course we're going to need to have Node installed, right? Node -- version. I'm using version 14, long-term support version. All right. And so the idea here is, like most other programming languages, you can have access to the file system if you're running Node, right? If you're just downloading code from some website, right? We don't want that to access the file system because that could be dangerous. If we're running something on our own system, we are explicitly running it with Node, so we should be aware of what code's running, and it's more safe, right? It's a security thing. All right, so let's dig in a little bit. Let's start with a new file, and this is going to be called read.js. And we're going to have a data file, so data.txt. And here I'm going to just have my name in here, maybe 2 lines. And by default, when I save in Atom, it adds an extra new line character. Right, so that's common for most text editors. All right, so this is just a data file, and the first item is the name, second item is the last name. Right, the first line is first name, second last name. So then here, since we're using server-side JS, we have to use a system to be able to import additional functionality, right? And so this is Node specific. So you can't do this in the browser. You do not have this sort of additional functionality in the same way. Now, there have been efforts to sort of merge the many systems in which you can import external libraries in JavaScript, and that gets quite complex because it's been rather messy. It's been about a 10-year ordeal where they've been trying to figure this out. So it gets a little bit messy, but for what we're doing, this only you can only use this syntax on Node.js, right? So this is called CommonJS, and it's a way of importing external libraries. So what we want to import is the file system library, right? So we can say let require and just fs. So that stands for fs, or file system. And normally when you're importing something, right, you're never going to want to change this variable. So we're going to go ahead and use the const variable declaration. And so now we can, once we've required this fs library, I can't set fs to something else. Right? This is going to be an error, right? Because once I set it with const, it's only set one time, and once you try to assign it another value, that's going to cause an error. All right, so this is read.js. We're going to run node read.js, and sure enough, it says there's an error, assignment to constant variable. So that's not allowed, right? So that's a good thing. That's a protection thing. But what I want to do is use fs to read in some data here, right? I've got this file, so let's say fs, and we're going to read file, and we're going to read it synchronously. Okay. Now, you've probably heard many times that JavaScript is asynchronous. So on server-side JS, they add in a lot of the asynchronous functions. They make a synchronous version of it. And the reason they do that is because the asynchrony can get a little bit hard to work with, and especially for beginners. the asynchronous nature of JavaScript is really a good thing, and if you are familiar with how it works, it's usually the best way to solve your problems. But in the interest of making things a little bit easier to read, we're going to use the synchronous version of most of our imported library functions. So read file is also a function. Now the reason this is asynchronous is because you have to think about what's happening. We're going to pass in a file name, so our file name is data.txt, right? And we want to pass that in, and what has to happen? Well, the file system has to go and get that file and read in the data, and then eventually it has to be stored in a variable. So what happens in my JavaScript program while that's going on? Well, in most programming languages, the program just waits. So nothing can be executed. Nothing else in your program can work. It just waits until this happens. And so that's not that big of a deal with a small file, but depending on what you're doing, if you have a huge data file or any number of different things can take a while, right? You want that to execute asynchronously, and then when it's finished, do something, right? Instead of just forcing your program to wait. Now, specifically with web technology, the reason we don't want to force anything to wait is because usually there's a web page associated with what we're doing, right? So while we're going and hitting a web service and saving data or retrieving data to read, we don't want the user to not be able to click anything. Surely you've all experienced some web page that when you click a button, it's non-responsive. And then you try to click a few other things and nothing works because it's doing something. That's a really annoying user experience, right? You want them to be able to do other things while something else is happening. So that's core to JavaScript, and that's why JavaScript does everything asynchronously, so by default. But there are, especially with the server-side JS, Node.js adds in several of these synchronous methods. So we're going to read the file in synchronously, and we're going to pass in, this is an options object. Okay, so this is the file that we want to read, and then the options object we're going to pass in. We're going to set an encoding property and just call that UTF-8. Okay, so this is the text encoding. You've probably learned about ASCII characters. Takes 7 bits for the first 128 characters in ASCII, and UTF-8 is an 8-bit encoding, and it's backwards compatible with ASCII, and it's by and large what everything uses today. It wasn't the first encoding. ASCII was one of the first encodings, and then there were lots of other encodings, and none of them worked together nicely. So Unicode appeared and was trying to get some consistency among all of these different encodings, and then finally UTF-8 was developed, and that is sort of the encoding to rule them all so far. So by and large, this is what everything uses, UTF-8. All right, so this is just telling our function we're going to read in this data and telling us what type of data we're looking at. All right, so we also want to store this in a variable, so this is going to be our file data. Oops, file data there. Console.log, and I can just print out this file data. So this is a simple read, and it prints out everything that was in the file. So I can access a file and read in the data. And then if I wanted to do something a little bit more complicated, I might split up the lines and make an array out of the items, right? So I could say list, let list equal file data dot split over the new line character. All right, so this is going to make an array, and it's going to use the new line character. So at the end of each one of these lines, there's a new line character. So everything in between the new lines is going to be an element of the array. All right, so if we run this and we log list instead of file data, we see this. And this is actually accurate because we had a new line after Luke, we had a new line after May, and then there was nothing. So that's the empty string. So it takes out whatever character you split by, that's the delimiter. It removes that, and everything in between from the beginning to the first new line, that's the first element. That new line to the next new line is the next element. right? So it splits up the string by this character, and you can do it with any character you want. So now I've got this list, and I want to probably remove this last item because that's not useful. So I'm going to say list.pop, and that removes the last item in your list. Okay, and so now I've moved from raw data in a file. The data in the file is just string data, and now I have a sense of structure. Okay, so now I have this list. This is more structured than just having an array with new lines. Now I can access individual elements. I can move the elements around. I couldn't do that easily with just a raw string, right? So that's one way I can collect data, and I can parse the string data. All right, so you probably have heard the term parse data. All right, parse a string. What that basically means is to extract meaning from, right? So usually when you're parsing, you need to extract meaning from a string in some particular way. So parsing is used all the time. Let's look at Node in interactive mode. To convert a string into a number or an integer, I can use the parse int function. Okay, what number do I want to parse? Well, I have to pass in a string. So let's pass in the number 101, and now this returns the number 101. I can check that with type of parse int 101. All right, so this is a number. I can also parse binary strings. So by default, the second argument is base 10, so I'm parsing that string as if it was a base 10 number. But what if this was a binary number? What would that be? So that would be base 2. Okay, so in different contexts, there are different meanings to this string, right? So it's very important that we parse it. We are applying or extracting meaning from the string in a particular way. Okay, so parsing is something that comes up all the time in computer programming. Before your code is executed, the string, it's just a file. So all of this text is just string data. So the engine, that's the parsing engine portion of your programming language, grabs this string data and parses it. And that means it extracts meaning. It finds all the keywords, right? It finds const. It knows what the functions are. It knows all these different things, and whatever you've typed, it applies meaning to those things. Okay, so this is the idea of parsing data, right? And so here what we've done is we've had a simple data file. This is just string data, and we've parsed it. And it's a really simple parsing. We have parsed it by making a list of all of the items between the new line characters. Okay, that's about as simple as a parse as you can get. All right, so that's reading in data. All right, and then we can write data. So let's make a new file, and this is going to be write.js. Okay, and we're going to have const fs require. So this is the library that we're requiring, and the name of the library is fs. And again, this is only in Node. Fs is only in server-side JS. And I won't say only Node because there's a couple, nowadays there's a couple competing JS engines running on the server side, but mostly Node.js is the major player, so that's the one most people use. So FS is available. You can't use this statement if you're using browser JavaScript. Okay. All right, and I'll go ahead and copy that to the read.js too, just so we're real clear on that. All right, so now I want to write something. So let's say I have some things in an array. I have let list equal, and this is going to be John Smith. So this is going to be my new name, right? Because I have my data file right now, it's got my name in it, and then write is going to change that name. Right? So we have this list of data, so we're going from structured data. Now we need to go into reverse. we need to join it and make a string, because that's how we write the file. The data file is just a file that just contains a string. That's what most text files are. That's what all text files are. They're just a data file, and the data inside them is just UTF-8 characters. It's just string data. Now, if you want meaning beyond that, then you have to parse the string. Okay, so here we're starting with structured data, and we need to make it simpler. We need to make it a string. Okay, so here we can say list dot join, and we're going to join this list with the new line character. And so this is going to result in string data. So let me declare that variable, and don't forget your semicolon. All right. So string data, list.join. So now let's see, console.log string data. Oops. All right. So we can exit and run node, and we're running write.js. Okay, so we see it added the new line character in between both of the elements. So we sort of destructured the data, right? We destructured it. This is a structured form. There's more things I can do with the data in this form. And if I destructure it, there's fewer things I can do with it, but I can write it to a file. All right, so this is destructured data. If I want to keep this style, there's an extra new line at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and add that as well. After I join those items, I'm going to just add an extra new line at the end. Okay, so now when we run this, we should see that extra new line like we had before up here when we printed this out. Okay, so John Smith, there we go. So we've got write working with everything except actually writing the data. So I want to write this to a file. So I can say fs write file, and I'm going to use the synchronous version again. What is the file name? This is data.txt, and this path is relative to wherever my terminal is right now. So I'm in the desktop, so when I reference data.txt, it's going to be relative to where my terminal is. Alright, so data.txt, and then I need to specify an encoding, UTF-8, and then I need to pass in the data. And to be honest, I forget the order here, so let's look this up. And it's good to pull up the documentation for these tools that you're using. So we're going to look up Node.js write file sync. Okay, and sometimes you'll get a nice Geeks for Geeks is a good website. It has some nice explanations, but there's an official documentation. So Node.js API, that's the application programming interface, and it's going to explain everything that has to do with FS. Okay, so we can click on this one, and this is the official documentation. Okay, so we can search for write file sync. Okay, so yeah, I couldn't remember if the options comes at the end or as the second argument. So it turns out that you have file first and then data, and then the options object with the encoding. Okay, so knowing where the documentation is and how to read the documentation, because you see this does look a little bit intimidating, right? So take your time with documentation. Don't get overwhelmed, and really try to understand what it's saying. The more you get used to reading technical documents, the better. It's going to make you a much better coder. All right, so here you know, and that happens especially if you use lots of different languages where you forget the exact signature of a function. So that's why the documentation is important. So what are we going to run here? We are writing data.txt, and we're going to pass in string data as the next argument, and then we have our encoding object. Right? So now we can run this right? We have no console.out, but we can check our data.txt and we see the name has changed. All right, that's basic reading and writing in Node.js, but I want to add to this a little bit of complexity because it's much more common to write structured data. Okay, so like if you have a program that you've written, there might be a configuration. So for example, with Atom, let's open a file. Let's go into home.atom. Show the hidden files with Control-H. .atom, and there's a config.cson. Okay, this file is structured data. Okay, and we're going to be talking about JSON, which CSON is sort of based on. It just gets rid of some of the brackets and some of the stuff. But this is structured data. It uses indentation to designate code blocks and different things, but or data blocks rather. All right, but the idea is you have a label, a colon, and a value, right? Label, colon, and then a value. And so if there's indentation, then that's an object, right? But we see this data is structured. It's not just like our data list, that's one line at a time. This is structured too, but we see that there are more opportunities to parse this in interesting ways, okay? And so we're going to look at another type of structured data called JSON, and it's most common. JSON is probably the most common format for data interchange. I would think it's up there if it's not the most common. All right, so and its syntax is very, very similar to just JavaScript objects. Okay, so it's called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this data.json. And JSON can start either as like a JavaScript object with curly brackets, or an array style JavaScript object. So cats, dogs, birds. Right, so this is valid JSON, except JSON is sort of unforgiving. It's not as forgiving as JavaScript. So I believe you cannot have the comma there. We're going to try that real quick. But I believe it's an error. The last item can't have a comma, and you can't have things like comments. So comments aren't allowed in JSON files, which is actually really, really frustrating. So if you want some of this fancier style stuff where you can have commas at the end and allow comments, which I do, in almost all of my programs, I use something called JSON 5, which is basically everything JSON is, but it adds a little bit more functionality, and it's called JSON for humans, right? And so then this gives you almost everything is the same, except you can use comments. You don't have to use quotation marks around the keys and that sort of thing. So this sort of style matches more like JavaScript. In JavaScript I can create an object like this, right? I don't have to put quotation marks around the keys. That's more like a Python dictionary. In Python you have to put quotation marks around the keys, and then you have a value. All right, so it's very similar. JSON, plain JSON, is very similar to JavaScript, except there are some quirks. You cannot have undefined. It's very picky. So let's just test this real quick to see if that's valid. And so what we're going to do is we're going to read this JSON data. And again, this is just text. I know it looks colorized, right? But that's just my text editor colorizing this. This is just a file with text in it, and then there's white space here, right? But I can parse this string and make it structured data. I can do that with the JSON parser. All right, so first what we need to do is read this data in. So we're going to have a new file that's going to be JSON read.js. All right, and then we're going to have our fs, and we're going to require, which is like importing a library. We're going to require fs, and we're going to say fs.readFileSync, and we're going to read in the file data.json this time. And we add our encoding, and that's UTF-8. Okay, we want to read in that data, and that gives us file data. Okay, and then we'll just console.log that to start with. File data. Okay, so the name of this file is JSON read, so let's run this. We have node and JSON read. Okay, and we see this is just text, right? It looks like an object, right? It looks like an array, but what happens if I were to try to access the first element? Right? Let's see. So this is the item at index 0. What do we get? Well, since it's just a string, it's going to give us that first character, right? So this is not the structured data of an array. It is structured in the sense that it's just a string of characters. Now a string is somewhat structured. There's an order. There's a beginning character and an ending character, right? So this isn't what we might think it is by looking at it, right? So let's try to convert this into a structured object. So we can do that with json.parse. This is a function, and we're going to try to parse file data. So you pass in a string. So generally speaking, parsing, well, that's not entirely true. What I was going to say is, generally speaking, when you parse, it has to do with string parsing. But you can also parse binary data. You can parse all sorts of data. But you're extracting meaning. So parsing strings is something we do all the time, right? So we're extracting meaning, more significant meaning from this string of characters, right? So we're going to try to parse this, and this should return an array. So let array, ARR, equal json.parse. Now, I believe this is going to cause an error because of this comma at the end, but I'm just sort of double checking that right now because it's kind of picky. Yes, okay. Syntax error, unexpected token at JSON position 39. So this ending closing bracket, it didn't like that because I had this comma at the end. So that's frustrating. If I get rid of that comma, everything's fine. Now, that's one reason why I like JSON 5, and I highly recommend that. All right. So now instead of logging the file data, let's log the array and see what we have there. And now this is more what we're used to. We see we do have an array. What happens when I do something like that? That gives us the first element of the array. So we see that we do have structured data. Now, why is this useful? Well, this is incredibly useful because our program, all of our programs can modify the state of the variables, right? I can have a program that has all these different variables that have different values stored in them. But then once my program stops, my program runs in memory, and so those values disappear, right? If I shut down the computer, those values disappear, right? If I want to keep track of the state of my program long term, I'm going to have to write it to a file. And if I can write it to a file in a structured format of arrays and objects, which is mostly what I already use anyway, it's extremely convenient for me to just dump everything into a JSON file and then shut down my computer. And then when I run the program again, I can load up all this information from a JSON file and then start up where I left off. Okay, so let's do an example. Let's see. So write file sync. Oh wait, we're on JSON read. There we go. So it works for arrays, or also we could have objects, right? And if we have object, this would be like animal1, or maybe Bob's pet, something like that. There would be keys and values. But in this case, we just used an array. So either one is valid JSON. Just remember, you cannot have the last line with commas, despite that being overwhelmingly a good practice in JavaScript. Okay, so again, JSON 5 is where it's at. So here we've got this file where we're reading the data in. Now let's say each time we want to maybe add another number or add something to this list, right? So well, first let's just go the other way. We've got JSON read, so let's make JSON write. We'll do this real quick. JSON write.js. Okay, and so we're going in reverse. So we have const fs require fs and we're going to start with structured data, and this will be a different set of animals: bears, wolves, and boars. Okay, so we have structured data here, and we want to convert that to somewhat unstructured data or less structured data, because we need to convert that to a string, and that's because we can write strings to files very easily. Right? Let me make sure that was saved. Okay, back to JSON.write. So here, to do that, we want to say JSON.stringify. Okay, so the two ways to convert structured data to and from a string. To go to a string, you use JSON, and that has to be all caps, .stringify. And then you pass in the structured data, ARR. And then we can console.log this, ARR. Right? And if you wanted to go the other way, you want to go from string data to a structured object, you parse the string. All right, so back to JSON.write. JSON.write. Okay, and we see it has. Oh, I didn't store this. Yeah, that's the array. We want string data here. String data. Okay, and so now we see this is string data. Now if I just wrote this is just string data. So if I wrote this in data.json, it would just be one line, right? This style is a little bit easier to read. So we can pass in some options to JSON.stringify. So here the first item is the data, the structured data that I want to stringify, right? The second argument is a filter, so you can filter out certain properties on that data. So almost always you're going to have this be null as the second parameter. And then this last parameter is how many what indentation do you want in the spacing. So this is going to make it print pretty like this, where you have nested data. So I could have, you know, more lists of data, and they're pretty, they're structured well, right? There's right, but then I could have some other list in here, or even an object like this. Right, so this is structured data, and it's pretty, right? One item per line. It's much more clear what's going on than if this was all put together on one line. All right, so that's what this is doing. This is going to make this pretty, but it's still going to be a string. Okay, so this is still string data. It just automatically adds that pretty formatting, like a new line and then 4 spaces for indentation. So it does all of that for us. So now I can say fs.writefile sync, and I want to pass in, or I want to write to data.json, and I want to pass in string data, and then the encoding is UTF-8. All right, so we can run this JSON.write. We don't really need this console.log anymore, but we see in here that our file has changed. Bears, wolves, and boars. Okay, but this is very powerful. It allows us to read and write structured data. And so if I have a really complicated object, a very large object with lots of stuff in it, I don't have to think about how I'm going to store that into a file and structure that file. I can just already use an existing format, JSON. And we can read and write from JSON very easily. So JSON is incredibly powerful, and it's used all over the web. So it's definitely worth your while to get used to JSON. All right? And so what we can do, let's see. Well, that should be good enough for now. I was going to do a program where we can run the program, and then it adds to JSON data every time. It adds like a random number, and then that shows that you can, save the state of your program, and then if you run your program again, you load in that state and continue where you left off, right? But we can do that another time. This video is already getting kind of long. All right, so this is basically just file system reads and writes. This can only be done on server-side JavaScript. It can't be done in the browser. We learned a lot in this video. We learned about CommonJS and requiring modules, and again, this is only for server-side JS. There's lots of different modules, but this syntax only works in this gets complicated. This is CommonJS syntax, but there are different syntax loaders that mimic this behavior. AMD style in the browser uses a require function, and so it looks like CommonJS, but they've moved past that. The latest JavaScript modules are coming along, and they use a different syntax entirely. They use an import style syntax that's more like a Python import. Okay, but anyway, Node.js and server-side JS still use this sort of require syntax, so it's important that you know this. So whenever you see this, generally speaking, it's going to be on server-side JS. All right, so we learned about that. We learned about reading and writing files. We learned about synchronous reads and writes versus asynchronous, and then we learned about JSON. So the two things with JSON. So if we want to convert to string data to structured data, we're going to parse the string, and it basically means extract meaning. So we're gonna extract additional meaning from that string, right? And then that gives us an array or an object, right? And then JSON.write. If we have a structured piece of data, a structured object, right? We want to convert that into a string, so that way we can throw that string data into a file. All right. So that should do it for this video. Hopefully you learned something.